All right, so get this. Canada's immigration strategy is getting a huge GE shift, and we're going to deep dive into what that means for you. We've got reports from Bloomberg, the National Post Benefits and Pensions Monitor, and they're all saying Canada's slamming on the brakes on its record-breaking population growth, actually aiming for a decline. It's a complex policy reversal with a whole bunch of ripple effects that we got to explore.
Yeah, what's really interesting here is the sheer scale of this change. We're potentially looking at a net loss of about 900,000 non-permanent residents in just the next few years. To put that into perspective, imagine if the entire state of Indiana just vanished. Poof, gone.
Oh, that's a crazy image. So Canada has been all about welcoming newcomers, even setting record immigration numbers just recently. So why this sudden U-turn?
Well, the articles point to a few things. Some political maneuvering seems to be involved.
Yeah.
Prime Minister Trudeau is a big champion of mass migration. But now public support for immigration is waning, and his Liberal Party is facing some tough pulls. So it looks like he's changing course.
Interesting. So how's Canada planning to pull this off? Is everyone just expected to pack up and leave on a certain date?
It seems like the plan centers around a ton of people leaving when their temporary visas run out. It's an unprecedented number. We're talking about 1.3 million projected to lose their status in 2024 alone.
That's a mind-blowing number. But is it realistic to expect that many people to just up and leave? People build lives, put down roots? It can't be that simple.
You're right, it's not that simple. Even top economists like Henry Lawton and Tiff Macklem, the Bank of Canada's head honcho, are skeptical about so many people actually leaving. They're wondering if everyone's really going to uproot themselves, especially since so many have built lives here and want to stay.
It makes you wonder what happens to the people who do want to stay. What about the human side of all this? These aren't just numbers. We're talking about real people.
Absolutely. And this is where it gets really interesting. The articles mention rallies all across Canada with foreign students and workers demanding a way to get permanent residency. They even have a powerful slogan, good enough to work, good enough to stay, which highlights the emotional core of this issue. It raises some big questions about fairness and belonging.
That slogan is powerful.
Yeah.
It makes you think about what it means to contribute to a society and wanting to be accepted as a part of it. This whole exodus strategy, though, seems to be based on the idea that everyone here is on a temporary visa. What about the undocumented migrants, the ones who might have overstayed their visas or slipped through the cracks? How does the government even plan for them?
That's a tough one. Nobody really knows how many undocumented migrants are in Canada. Estimates are all over the place, from as low as 20,000 to as high as 500,000.
Whoa, that's a huge GE margin of error. It's like we're dealing with a complete unknown here. Didn't one of the articles mention something about those estimates being potentially way off?
Yeah, Benjamin Tal, a well-known economist, he suggested the official numbers might be way too low because of some assumptions they're making about people overstaying their visas. We're basically working with incomplete data, which makes this whole situation even harder to predict.
Okay, so we've got this plan that relies on millions of people leaving with a lot of doubt about whether that's even going to happen. And then we've got this unknown number of undocumented migrants, adding another layer of complexity. So what happens if people just don't leave? Are we going to see mass deportations like what happened in the U.S. with the Trump administration?
That's the question a lot of people are asking. But so far, it seems like Canada's going in a different direction. Trudeau hasn't announced any plans for mass deportations. Instead, they seem to be focusing on tightening border security.
So no dramatic roundups or forced departures. What about people who have overstayed their visas? How does Canada plan on dealing with those cases?
Well, the Canada Border Services Agency, the CBSA, they handle those situations.
Right.
They can issue exclusion orders, which basically make someone leave the country and prevent them from coming back for at least a year. Detention is also a possibility, but the CBSA says that's only a last resort.
So it sounds like they're trying to encourage people to leave rather than forcing them out. Are all the political parties on board with this approach, though? There have got to be some different opinions.
Oh, definitely.
Huh.
This is a hot-button issue, and not everyone's happy with the strategy. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, for example, he's calling for the government to have a more concrete plan to make sure these departures actually happen.
What are his specific concerns? Is he worried about people slipping through the cracks?
He's bringing up the possibility of increased tension with the U.S. if we have a sudden increase in undocumented migrants trying to cross the border. He's also worried about what this mass exodus or potential lack thereof will do to the economy. It raises questions about whether this strategy is sustainable in the long term.
That makes sense. It's not just about moving people around, it's about the impact on Canada's entire social and economic fabric. Speaking of the economy, this whole population shift or potential shift has got to have some major implications, right?
Absolutely. The economic fallout is one of the most hotly debated aspects of this strategy. For example, there are a lot of different opinions on how this will affect inflation, which is already a big worry for Canadians.
Break that down for me. How could a smaller population actually affect prices? Wouldn't fewer people mean less demand and therefore lower prices?
That's one side of the argument. Some experts believe that with fewer workers around, the job market will get even tighter, which could actually push inflation higher. Think about it. If companies are having trouble finding employees, they might have to raise wages to attract people, and those costs could get passed down to consumers as higher prices.
That makes sense. But I thought less demand usually leads to lower prices.
You're right, that's the other side of the argument. Economists like David Rosenberg, they say that with fewer people spending money, demand will go down, which could put downward pressure on prices. It's a classic push and pull situation.
It's like a tug of war between these two forces.
Yep.
So where does the Bank of Canada stand on this? They're usually the ones trying to keep inflation under control.
The Bank of Canada has acknowledged how complex these opposing forces are. Their next forecast update in January will be very interesting to keep an eye on. Will they factor in the government's immigration plans, even with all the uncertainty around them? It's a question a lot of people are asking.
It sounds like there are a lot of moving parts here, and we're only just beginning to see the effects of this immigration shift. But what about the impact on Canada's overall economic growth? Canada has relied on immigration for a long time to fuel its economy. So how will shrinking the population affect that?
That's a crucial question, and it's where some of the most intense debate is happening. Remember, Canada has depended on immigration to boost its population and workforce. It's been a key driver of economic growth. But now, with the government aiming for population decline, that equation changes dramatically.
Right. More people usually means more spending, more jobs, more growth. But now we're talking about reversing that trend. Has the Bank of Canada expressed any worries about this?
They have. They've already voiced concerns about what a shrinking workforce could do to GDP growth. They're worried that a smaller pool of workers could lead to slower economic expansion, making it harder for Canada to compete globally.
So that's a potential downside. But aren't there also arguments that a smaller population could be a good thing for the economy?
There are definitely different perspectives. Some people argue that slower, more sustainable growth could be better in the long run. They believe it could ease the strain on housing infrastructure and social services, which have been stretched thin by all the rapid growth in recent years.
So it's the classic debate, short-term pain versus long-term gain. But it's not just about numbers, is it? This policy shift also brings up some pretty big questions about Canada's identity and values. Canada has always been proud of being a welcoming and multicultural society. How does this new approach to immigration fit into that image?
That's a great point. You've hit the nail on the head. This new approach is making Canadians think about what those ideals really mean in practice. How do we balance economic concerns with humanitarianism? How do we decide how much population growth is sustainable, both economically and socially? These are tough questions with no easy answers.
It feels like we're at a crossroads. We need to figure out what kind of Canada we want moving forward. And these aren't just questions for politicians and policymakers. They're questions for all Canadians. This is a defining moment for the country.
Absolutely. And these questions are probably going to be debated for years to come. It's clear this immigration shift is a turning point for Canada with consequences that will reach far into the future.
We've covered a lot today, but we've only scratched the surface of this complex issue. We need to dig deeper into the social and political ramifications of this policy change and look at its impact on specific areas like housing and healthcare. But we'll save that for another time. We'll continue this conversation in our next installment. Welcome back to our deep dive into Canada's immigration shift. You know, it's got me thinking about the potential impact on Canada's social fabric. We talked about Canada relying on immigration to boost its population and workforce. Hasn't that created a kind of dependency?
That's a really good point. Think about sectors like healthcare, elder care, even construction. They've come to rely a lot on immigrant labor, often for jobs Canadians don't want to do.
So if the flow of temporary workers suddenly slows down, are those sectors going to be hit even harder by labor shortages? What's that going to mean for the average Canadian? Longer wait times to see a doctor, construction projects taking forever.
It's definitely a possibility. And the ripple effect could impact the entire economy. Imagine waiting even longer for healthcare delays and building projects, rising costs for basic services. It's not just about the numbers, it's about how those numbers affect people's everyday lives.
Yeah, that's a sobering thought. But I'm also thinking about those arguments in favor of slowing down immigration. The strain on housing infrastructure, social services, those are legitimate concerns, right? Are we just swapping one set of problems for another?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Those concerns are totally valid. Rapid population growth has definitely put a strain on those systems, especially in big cities like Toronto and Vancouver, where housing affordability is a huge crisis. Schools, hospitals, public transportation, they're all feeling the pressure. Some argue that slowing immigration would give these systems time to catch up and become more sustainable.
Like hitting the pause button, taking a breath, figuring out the next steps. But how do you actually measure something as complex as sustainability when we're talking about population growth?
That's the million-dollar question. There's no easy answer. It's about weighing different priorities, economic interests, social values, environmental concerns. And whose priorities are we even talking about? Politicians, economists, everyday Canadians? Each group brings a different perspective.
It feels like this is about more than just numbers. We're talking about values, identity, the kind of society we want for ourselves and for future generations.
Exactly. This isn't just about economic policy, it's about who we are as a nation.
So let's zoom out for a second. How is this shift in Canada's immigration policy being seen on the international stage?
It's definitely raising eyebrows, especially in countries that have always seen Canada as a land of opportunity, a model of multiculturalism.
I can see that Canada's reputation for being welcoming and inclusive has attracted immigrants and refugees for decades. Is this shift changing that perception?
That's a big concern. Some people see it as a sign that Canada is becoming more inward-looking, less open to newcomers, especially with the rise of populism and anti-immigrant sentiment around the world. This shift could be seen as part of a global trend.
What about Canada's diplomatic relationships? Could this create problems with countries that rely on sending temporary workers to Canada?
It's possible, especially with countries like India and the Philippines, who have a lot of citizens working in Canada on temporary visas.
Hmm.
They could feel the effects of these changes pretty directly.
And that could create diplomatic challenges for Canada if those countries see this new policy as discriminatory or unfair.
It's a delicate balancing act for
Sure.
sure. Canada needs to manage these relationships carefully while also taking care of its own priorities.
Okay, so we've talked about the economic and social side of things and the international perspective. But what about the political fallout within Canada? How's this all playing out in Canadian politics?
This is a big issue politically, and it's already looking like it'll be a major battleground in the next election.
You mentioned earlier that Prime Minister Trudeau's reversal on immigration has been criticized by people on both sides of the political spectrum. What are people saying?
There's a lot of disagreement even within his own party. Some liberals feel like he's given in to populist pressure, while others believe he's making tough but necessary decisions.
And what about the Conservative Party? How are they reacting to this change?
With Pierre Poilievre as their leader, they're using this as a chance to attack the liberals. They're saying Trudeau has mishandled the immigration system and created chaos.
And I bet they're tapping into those anxieties. Some Canadians feel that immigration has gotten out of hand and is having a negative effect on their lives.
It's a powerful message for sure, and it definitely resonates with some voters.
So it's a political minefield. How Trudeau handles this issue could determine his future in politics. There's a lot riding on this. This immigration shift isn't just a change in policy. It's a turning point for Canada with big consequences.
Absolutely. And as we go forward, it's important to remember that immigration isn't just about numbers and the economy. It's about people, their lives, and their dreams. It's easy to get lost in the abstract debates about economic models and policy frameworks. But we can't forget about the human impact of these decisions.
And we've done a good job highlighting those human stories in this deep dive. We've talked about the worries and uncertainty people are feeling, but also their hopes and aspirations for a better future. Those are the things that really stay with you.
Exactly. We need to remember that behind every statistic, every policy decision, there are real people whose lives are being affected.
This deep dive has been a whirlwind of information and insights, but one thing is clear. Canada's immigration system is going through a major transformation, and the road ahead is probably going to be bumpy.
It's a journey with both challenges and opportunities, and it's going to require careful planning, thoughtful discussion, and a commitment to finding solutions that work for all Canadians.
That's a great point. We can't just focus on the problems we need to be actively looking for solutions. But before we move on, let's go back to something we talked about earlier, the assumption that this whole strategy depends on a massive exodus of temporary residents. What if that doesn't happen as planned?
That's a really important question, and the government needs to be ready for it. If those departures don't happen, it could throw the whole plan off track.
It would be a logistical and political nightmare, wouldn't it? What would happen then?
Imagine the pressure on the government to come up with a plan B. It could reignite the debate about what to do with undocumented migrants and potentially lead to even more heated political arguments and social division.
It makes you wonder if this plan is built on shaky ground. Are we putting all our eggs in one basket, hoping for an outcome that might not even be realistic?
It shows how important it is to have a strong and flexible immigration system, one that can adapt to changing circumstances and unexpected challenges. We need a system that can handle the unexpected.
And it highlights the need for the government to be clear about its plans and intentions. People need to know what to expect, both those who are already in Canada and those thinking about coming here. Transparency and clarity are crucial, especially when things are uncertain and changing.
I agree. We can't afford to have mixed messages or vague promises. People need to know what they're dealing with, and the government needs to be upfront about the potential challenges and the steps they're taking to address them.
It seems like we've uncovered another layer of complexity in this already complicated issue. This deep dive has been really eye-opening. It's clear that immigration is never simple.
It's a complex issue with threads of economics, demographics, politics, culture, and human aspirations woven together. To really understand it, we need to look at the whole picture.
And we need to remember that as Canadians, we have a responsibility to shape that picture thoughtfully and compassionately.
Well said. It's a responsibility we can't take lightly.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive. We've explored the human side of Canada's immigration shift, the political back and forth, and the ripple effects around the world. Now I want to tackle the elephant in the room. Can Canada really thrive economically if its population's shrinking?
That is the question, isn't it? Economists and policymakers are divided. Some say Canada's economic engine has always relied on population growth, driven in large part by immigration.
Yeah, it's that classic argument. More people equals more prosperity, more consumers, more workers, more demand, more growth. But now the government wants to reverse that growth. Is that a recipe for economic disaster? Or are we just thinking about this the wrong way?
Well, the critics of this new approach are definitely worried. They're saying a smaller workforce will lead to labor shortages, slower economic growth, and ultimately a decline in Canada's ability to compete globally. But it's not as simple as that.
I'm thinking about those who say a smaller population could actually be good for Canada in the long run. Is there any truth to that?
There is. Some people who support slower growth say it could ease the strain on housing infrastructure and social services, eventually leading to a more balanced and sustainable economy.
So it's that classic trade-off. Short-term pain for potential long-term gain. But how do you measure something as complex as sustainability when the future is so unpredictable? It's like trying to predict the weather 10 years out.
It's a big gamble. And we're not just talking about numbers here. We're talking about people's livelihoods, their quality of life, the prosperity of the nation. The stakes are high.
Let's look at one area that's going to be hugely affected by this. Housing Canada is already dealing with a housing crisis. How will fewer people coming into the country affect that? Will it finally make housing more affordable?
It's easy to think that, right, fewer people competing for a limited number of homes should, in theory, bring prices down. But some experts are saying it might not be that straightforward.
So even if immigration slows down sky high, housing prices might not go anywhere. What's the missing piece here?
Canada's housing shortage is a really complicated issue. It's affected by things like zoning laws, lack of new construction, and speculative investment. Those are deep-rooted problems that aren't going to disappear overnight.
So it's not just about how many people are coming in, it's about how we're managing the housing market itself. Slowing down immigration might not be the quick fix people are hoping for.
Some people even say that slowing immigration could make the housing situation worse. Think about it. If there are fewer skilled workers, that could make it harder for the construction industry to build new homes, which would shrink the supply even more.
Wow, so it's not a simple solution. This immigration shift is just one part of a much bigger picture. What stands out to you as the most important takeaway from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that immigration isn't just about the economy. It's tied to our social values, our political landscape, and ultimately our national identity.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening. It's clear that the impact of this immigration shift will be felt across Canada for years to come. What advice would you give our listeners as they try to make sense of it all?
I'd say look beyond the headlines and have thoughtful conversations about what kind of Canada we want to build. How do we create a system that's both economically sound and compassionate? How do we ensure a future where everyone feels like they have a fair chance no matter where they were born? Those are the questions we need to be asking ourselves.
That's great advice. This whole deep dive has been a bit of a whirlwind, but it's left me feeling hopeful. We have a lot of work to do, but if we can have open and honest discussions, I think we can create a future that's both prosperous and inclusive for everyone in Canada.
I like that prosperous and inclusive, that's a goal worth striving for. It's clear that we need to move past the polarized debates and simplistic solutions that we see so often when we talk about immigration. We need to have a more nuanced and informed conversation.
Absolutely. It's time for Canadians to roll up their sleeves and have a constructive dialogue about the future of immigration. This isn't about politics, it's about Canada.
Well said. It's about the future of our nation.
This has been a fantastic deep dive. We've explored a vast and complicated issue, and I'm sure our listeners have gained a deeper understanding of this crucial moment in Canada's immigration history.
I agree. We've covered a lot of ground, and I hope everyone listening is feeling more informed and engaged with this complex topic.
But even more than that, I hope this deep dive has sparked some critical thinking and reflection, because ultimately the future of Canadian immigration is in the hands of all Canadians.
It's a powerful thought. This isn't just something we watch on the sidelines. We all have a role to play in shaping the future of our country.
So to our listeners, I leave you with this. As Canada navigates this immigration shift, what role do you see yourself playing? How can you help create a future where Canada remains a welcoming and prosperous nation, one that embraces diversity while also addressing the concerns of its citizens?
That's a great question, and one that each of us needs to think about. It's time to step up and be part of the solution.
That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Canada's immigration shift. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.